Brakes. Who needs them, right? They just slow you down. Well, it turns out being able to stop is kind of important, so if your brakes aren't working well, you should probably do something about it. Today on Revzilla, I'm going to outline the best brake upgrades for your bike, and to do so, I'm going to use a motorcycle from our show CTXP that has especially shoddy brakes. I'm referring, of course, to the 2009 Versys 650, affectionately known around here as the Battletoad. Let's open up the shop manual. If you're not familiar with this Versys 650 Superleggera, Zach picked it up off of Craigslist so that we could do a track day on the cheap. And despite its very haggard appearance, the Battletoad actually goes and turns pretty well. The brakes, however, were a problem.
Brakes. Oh, Battletoad, slow down. Woo!
Now, if you're as bummed out by your bike's brakes as Zach was, don't immediately assume you need to spend money upgrading parts. Kick things off by making sure the brake system is tuned up, i.e. the brake pads aren't torched, the brake fluid doesn't look like swamp sauce, and there's some grease on the brake lever pivot, not just dust and rust. Brake fluid degrades over time and will make your lever feel squishy, and a dry lever pivot isn't going to rotate smoothly, especially under load. So if you're looking to improve your brake function, start with the simple stuff. I know maintenance isn't nearly as exciting as shopping for new parts on Revzilla, but it is pretty effective at restoring brake function, plus you don't have to wait for the UPS truck or spend much money. However, if tuning up the brakes doesn't do the trick, then it is time to start replacing parts. The easiest components to replace are your brake pads. Many OEM pads are of the semi-metallic variety, and they're designed for a gentle initial bite and a friendly overall feel. That's great for commuting and touring, but if you ride fast, whether that's on the racetrack or just in the twisties, and you want more bite and power when you pull the lever, then upgrading to sintered pads is a good idea. Sintered pads have a higher friction rating, which means they're going to have a stronger bite, more overall stopping power, and they're going to be more resistant to fading under hard use. Premium sintered pads like those from EBC or Galfer are about the same price as OEM, so it's a no-brainer to upgrade, especially if your stock pads are already worn out, which the Battletoads certainly were. And whenever you replace your brake pads, it's important to scrub the discs with Scotch-Brite and brake cleaner so the new pad has a clean surface to bed in against. You'll also need to break in your new brake pads with a series of progressively harder stops over the course of 25 to 50 miles. That being the case, don't expect those new pads to feel or function better right out of the gate. Brakes bled, new pads are in. At this point, we're not in it for a lot of time or money, but if you're still not satisfied with your brake performance, then the next thing I would suggest upgrading is your brake lines. If your bike has rubber brake lines like the Battletoad here, then swapping them out for braided stainless steel lines can net you a firmer lever feel and more feedback, especially under maximum braking. That's because rubber brake lines, while cheap and pretty effective, tend to swell and expand under pressure. That's going to rob feel at the lever. Meanwhile, stainless lines have that braided sheath around the hose, so they resist expansion, and that channels all of the pressure from the master cylinder down to the calipers where you want it. Stainless brake lines are a very effective upgrade, and they're not terribly expensive in terms of your dollars, but filling dry brake lines is always a pain in the butt, so it can be quite pricey in terms of your minutes. If you're rich with time, then don't worry, just keep pumping and bleeding, and know that tapping on the master cylinder, the brake lines, and the calipers will help dislodge any air bubbles that are trapped in the system. And if your bike has ABS, that also means it has a bunch of extra plumbing snaking around underneath the bodywork. And replacing all that is going to be a nightmare that might entail partially disassembling your bike. In other words, the juice probably isn't worth the squeeze. Okay, other than routine maintenance, brake pads, and maybe stainless steel brake lines, if you want to upgrade your brake system further, you're going to have to start spending serious money. And unless you're racing and hopefully running near the front, then I don't think it's a worthwhile investment. However, I know you're curious, so let's talk about master cylinders, rotors, and calipers. If you're so inclined, upgrading to a radial master cylinder can be a very effective way to increase your brake system's precision. That is especially true if your bike currently has an axial master cylinder, wherein the lever acts on a piston that is parallel to the handlebar. This system has an indirect force path, and that can rob feel while on the brakes. Meanwhile, a radial master cylinder has a lever that acts directly on the piston, which is perpendicular to the handlebar, and that can give you a lot more feedback under maximum braking. Also, aftermarket radial master cylinders like this Brembo are generally just built to a higher quality than OEM. They use stiffer forged castings, they have smoother pivots, and a lot more adjustability. None of this is necessarily going to give you more braking force, but it will give you a higher quality braking force. If you do opt for a new master cylinder, just make sure you get the right size piston, buy a reservoir kit if it's not included, and know that you may need to cut and splice the brake switch wires to ensure your brake light works. As for upgrading your brake discs, there are some benefits to be had from upgrading to fully floating rotors like these Galfers. By fully floating, I mean the disc is connected to the carrier by buttons that allow some lateral movement, which means the disc will be better aligned with the brake pads. However, these brake discs are going to cost you 600 bones, and while they do look nice, they are really expensive and you're probably not going to notice the performance improvement. You can also upgrade your calipers, but at that point, you might as well think about upgrading your bike. And before you do that, I want to give you one more recommendation that is free, and I'm betting it's going to give you more of an improvement than all of the parts I've talked about so far. And that is to practice hard braking. The fact is, most riders aren't familiar with the limits of their bike's current brakes, which, even if the lever is squishy or there's not a ton of feedback, are likely pretty powerful if you have the guts to use them. So, go find yourself a dry parking lot and practice some hard braking. It's a great skill builder and a good way to get familiar with the capability of your bike's brakes, especially if you have ABS that you've never engaged. We all love to point to the equipment as being a limiting factor, but 9.9 times out of 10, there's still a lot of improvement that needs to happen with the rider before any upgraded part can be fully utilized. So, in summary, stay up on your brake maintenance, replace your brake pads when they wear out, and maybe install stainless steel brake lines. But whatever you do to your motorcycle, make sure your braking skills are on point.